Master John Horseleigh, Knight, a short story by Thomas Hardy. In the earliest and mustiest volume of the Havenpool marriage registers, said the thin-faced gentleman, this entry may still be read by anyone curious enough to decipher the crabbed handwriting of the date. I took a copy of it when I was last there, and it runs thus. He had opened his pocketbook and now read aloud the extract, afterwards handing round the book to us, wherein we saw transcribed the following. Master John Horseleigh, Knight of the Piache of Clifton, was married to Edith the wife, late off John Stocker, Machante of Havenpool, the Dachij Dage of December, BPV Legge given by our Supam head of the Churchy of England King, Henry the Vale 1539. Now, if you turn to the long and elaborate pedigree of the ancient family of the Horseleys of Clifton Horseleigh, you will find no mention whatever of this alliance, notwithstanding the privilege given by the sovereign and head of the church, the said Sir John being therein chronicled as marrying, at a date apparently earlier than the above, the daughter and heiress of Richard Phillipson of Monteslope in Nether Wessex, a lady who outlived him, of which marriage there were issued 2 daughters and a son who succeeded him in his estates. How are we to account for these, as it would seem, contemporaneous wives? A strange local tradition only can help us, and this can be briefly told. One evening in the autumn of the year 1540 or 1541, a young sailor whose Christian name was Roger, but whose surname is not known, landed at his native place of Havenpool on the South Wessex coast after a voyage in the Newfoundland trade, then newly sprung into existence. He returned in the ship Primrose with a cargo of train oil brought home from the Newfoundland, to quote from the town records of the date. During his absence of 2 summers and a winter, which made up the term of a Newfoundland spell, many unlooked-for changes had occurred within the quiet little seaport, some of which closely affected Roger the sailor. At the time of his departure, his only sister Edith had become the bride of one Stocker, a respectable townsman and part owner of the brig in which Roger had sailed, and it was to the house of this couple, his only relatives, that the young man directed his steps. On trying the door in Key Street, he found it locked, and then observed that the windows were boarded up. Inquiring of a bystander, he learnt for the first time of the death of his brother-in-law, though that event had taken place nearly 18 months before. "And my sister Edith?" asked Roger. "She's married again, as they do say, and hath been so these 12 months. I don't vouch for the truth o't, though if she isn't, she ought to be." Roger's face grew dark. He was a man with a considerable reserve of strong passion, and he asked his informant what he meant by speaking thus. The man explained that shortly after the young woman's bereavement, a stranger had come to the port. He had seen her moping on the quay, had been attracted by her youth and loneliness, and in an extraordinarily brief wooing had completely fascinated her, had carried her off, and, as was reported, had married her. Though he had come by water, he was supposed to live no very great distance off by land. They were last heard of at Oosewood, in Upper Wessex, at the house of one Wall, a timber merchant where he believed she still had a lodging, though her husband, if he were lawfully that much, was but an occasional visitor to the place. "The stranger?" asked Roger. "Did you see him? What manner of man was he?" "I liked him not," said the other. "He seemed of that kind that hath something to conceal, and as he walked with her, he ever and anon turned his head and gazed behind him, as if he much feared an unwelcome pursuer. But faith," continued he, "it may have been the man's anxiety only. Yet did I not like him." "Was he older than my sister?" Roger asked. "Aye, much older, from a dozen to a score of years older. A man of some position, maybe, playing an amorous game for the pleasure of the hour. Who knoweth but that he have a wife already? Many have done the thing hereabouts of late." Having paid a visit to the graves of his relatives, the sailor next day went along the straight road which, then a lane, now a highway, conducted to the curious little inland town named by the Havenpool man. It is unnecessary to describe Oosewood on the South Avon. It has a railway at the present day, but 30 years of steam traffic past its precincts have hardly modified its original features. Surrounded by a sort of freshwater lagoon, dividing it from meadows and coppice, its ancient thatch and timber houses have barely made way even in the front street for the ubiquitous modern brick and slate. It neither increases nor diminishes in size. It is difficult to say what the inhabitants find to do, for though trades in woodware are still carried on, there cannot be enough of this class of work nowadays to maintain all the householders, the forests around having been so greatly thinned and curtailed. At the time of this tradition, the forests were dense, artificers in wood abounded, and the timber trade was brisk. Every house in the town, without exception, was of oak framework, filled in with plaster, and covered with thatch, the chimney being the only brick portion of the structure. Inquiry soon brought Roger the sailor to the door of Wall, the timber dealer referred to, but it was some time before he was able to gain admission to the lodging of his sister, the people having plainly received directions not to welcome strangers. She was sitting in an upper room on one of the lath-backed, willow-bottomed shepherd's chairs, made on the spot then as to this day, and as they were probably made there in the days of the Heptarchy. In her lap was an infant, which she had been suckling, though now it had fallen asleep. So had the young mother herself for a few minutes, under the drowsing effects of solitude. Hearing footsteps on the stairs, she awoke, started up with a glad cry, and ran to the door, opening which she met her brother on the threshold. "Oh, this is merry. I didn't expect thee," she said. "Ah, Roger, I thought it was John." Her tones fell to disappointment. The sailor kissed her, looked at her sternly for a few moments, and pointing to the infant, said, "You mean the father of this?" "Yes, my husband," said Edith. "I hope so," he answered. "Why, Roger, I'm married of a truth, am I?" she cried. "Shame upon ye, if true. If not true, worse. Master Stocker was an honest man, and ye should have respected his memory longer. Where is thy husband?" "He comes often. I thought it was he now. Our marriage has to be kept secret for a while. It was done privily for certain reasons. But we was married at church like honest folk, afore God we were, Roger, 6 months after poor Stocker's death." "'Twas too soon," said Roger. "I was living in a house alone. I had nowhere to go to. You were far over sea in the Newfound land, and John took me and brought me here." "How often doth he come?" says Roger again. "Once or twice weekly," says she. "I wish the deast waited till I returned, dear Edie," he said. "It mid be you are a wife. I hope so. But if so, why this mystery? Why this mean and cramped lodging in this lonely copse-circled town? Of what standing is your husband, and of where?" "He is of gentle breeding. His name is John. I am not free to tell his family name. He is said to be of London, for safety's sake, but he really lives in the county next adjoining this." "Where in the next county?" "I do not know. He has preferred not to tell me, that I may not have the secret forced from me, to his and my hurt, by bringing the marriage to the ears of his kinsfolk and friends." Her brother's face flushed. "Our people have been honest townsmen, well reputed for long. Why should you readily take such humbling from a sojourner of whom thou'st know nothing?" They remained in constrained converse till her quick ear caught a sound for which she might have been waiting, a horse's footfall. "It is John," said she. "This is his night Saturday." "Don't be frightened lest he should find me here," said Roger. "I am on the point of leaving. I wish not to be a third party. Say nothing at all about my visit, if it will incommode you so to do. I will see thee before I go afloat again." Speaking thus, he left the room, and descending the staircase, let himself out by the front door, thinking he might obtain a glimpse of the approaching horseman. But that traveller had in the meantime gone stealthily round to the back of the homestead, and peering along the pinion end of the house, Roger discerned him unbridling and haltering his horse with his own hands in the shed there. Roger retired to the neighboring inn called the Black Lamb and meditated. This mysterious method of approach determined him, after all, not to leave the place till he had ascertained more definite facts of his sister's position, whether she were the deluded victim of the stranger or the wife she obviously believed herself to be. Having eaten some supper, he left the inn, it being now about 11 o'clock. He first looked into the shed, and finding the horse still standing there, waited irresolutely near the door of his sister's lodging. Half an hour elapsed, and while thinking he would climb into a loft hard by for a night's rest, there seemed to be a movement within the shutters of the sitting room that his sister occupied. Roger hid himself behind a faggot stack near the back door, rightly divining that his sister's visitor would emerge by the way he had entered. The door opened, and the candle she held in her hand lighted for a moment the stranger's form, showing it to be that of a tall and handsome personage, about 40 years of age, and apparently of a superior position in life. Edith was assisting him to cloak himself, which being done, he took leave of her with a kiss and left the house. From the door she watched him bridle and saddle his horse, and having mounted and waved an adieu to her as she stood candle in hand, he turned out of the yard and rode away. The horse which bore him was, or seemed to be, a little lame, and Roger fancied from this that the rider's journey was not likely to be a long one. Being light of foot, he followed apace, having no great difficulty on such a still night in keeping within earshot some few miles, the horseman pausing more than once. In this pursuit, Roger discovered the rider to choose bridle tracks and open commons in preference to any high road. The distance soon began to prove a more trying one than he had bargained for, and when out of breath and in some despair of being able to ascertain the man's identity, he perceived an ass standing in the starlight under a hayrick, from which the animal was helping itself to periodic mouthfuls. The story goes that Roger caught the ass, mounted, and again resumed the trail of the unconscious horseman, which feat may have been possible to a nautical young fellow, though one can hardly understand how a sailor would ride such an animal without bridle or saddle and strange to his hands, unless the creature were extraordinarily docile. This question, however, is immaterial. Suffice it to say that at dawn the following morning, Roger beheld his sister's lover or husband entering the gates of a large and well-timbered park on the southwestern verge of the White Hart Forest, as it was then called, now known to everybody as the Vale of Blackmoor. Thereupon the sailor discarded his steed, and finding for himself an obscurer entrance to the same park a little further on, he crossed the grass to reconnoitre. He presently perceived amid the trees before him a mansion which, new to himself, was one of the best known in the county at that time. Of this fine manorial residence hardly a trace now remains, but a manuscript dated some years later than the events we are regarding describes it in terms from which the imagination may construct a singularly clear and vivid picture. This record presents it as consisting of a fair yellow freestone building, partly 2 and partly 3 stories, a fair halle and parlour, both wainscoted, a fair dining room and with drawing room, and many good lodgings. A kitchen adjoining backward to one end of the dwelling house, with a fair passage from it into the halle, parlour, and dining room, and cellars adjoining. In the front of the house a square green court, and a curious gatehouse with lodgings in it, standing with the front of the house to the south. In a large outer court, 3 stables, a coach-house, a large barn, and a stable for oxen and kine, and all houses necessary. Without the gatehouse, paled in, a large square green, in which standeth a fair chapelle, of the southeast side of the green court, towards the river, a large garden. Of the southwest side of the green court is a large bowling green, with flower-mounted walks about it, all walled about with a battled wall and set with all sorts of fruit, and out of it, into the fields, there are large walks, under many tall elms, orderly planted. Then follows a description of the orchards and gardens, the servants' offices, brewhouse, bakehouse, dairy, pigeon houses, and corn mill, the river and its abundance of fish, the warren, the coppices, the walks, ending thus. And all the country north of the house, open champaign, sandy fields, very dry and pleasant for all kinds of recreation, hunting and hawking, and profitable for tillage. The house hath a large prospect east, south, and west, over a very large and pleasant vale, is seated from the good market towns of Sherton Abbas 3 miles, and Ivell a mile, that plentifully yield all manner of provision, and within 12 miles of the South Sea. It was on the grass before this seductive and picturesque structure that the sailor stood at gaze under the elms in the dim dawn of Sunday morning, and saw to his surprise his sister's lover and horse vanish within the court of the building. Perplexed and weary, Roger slowly retreated, more than ever convinced that something was wrong in his sister's position. He crossed the bowling green to the avenue of elms, and, bent on further research, was about to climb into one of these, when, looking below, he saw a heap of hay apparently for horses or deer. Into this he crept, and having eaten a crust of bread, which he had hastily thrust into his pocket at the inn, he curled up and fell asleep, the hay forming a comfortable bed, and quite covering him over. He slept soundly and long, and was awakened by the sound of a bell. On peering from the hay, he found the time had advanced to full day. The sun was shining brightly. The bell was that of the fair chapelle on the green outside the gatehouse, and it was calling to matins. Presently the priest crossed the green to a little side door in the chancel, and then from the gateway of the mansion emerged the household. The tall man whom Roger had seen with his sister on the previous night, on his arm being a portly dame, and running beside the pair 2 little girls and a boy. These all entered the chapel, and the bell having ceased, and the environs become clear, the sailor crept out from his hiding. He sauntered towards the chapel, the opening words of the service being audible within. While standing by the porch, he saw a belated servitor approaching from the kitchen court to attend the service also. Roger carelessly accosted him and asked, as an idle wanderer, the name of the family he had just seen cross over from the mansion. "Odd zounds, if you modern be a stranger here in very truth, goodman. That was Sir John and his dame, and his children Elizabeth, Mary, and John." "I be from foreign parts. Sir John, what do ye corn?" "Master John Horseleigh, knight, who had a most as much lond by inheritance of his mother as a had by his father, and likewise some by his wife. Why, bain't his arms 3 golden horses' heads, and idden his lady the daughter of Master Richard Phillipson, of Monteslope, in Nether Wessex, known to us all? It mid be so, and yet it mid not. However, the LT miss thy prayers for such an honest knight's welfare, and I have to traipse seaward many miles." He went onward, and as he walked, continued saying to himself, "Now to that poor wronged fool Edie. The fond thing, I thought it. 'Twas too quick, she was ever amorous. What's to become of her? God wot! How be I going to face her with the news, and how be I to hold it from her, to bring this disgrace on my father's honoured name, a double-tongued knave?" He turned and shook his fist at the chapel, and all in it, and resumed his way. Perhaps it was owing to the perplexity of his mind that instead of returning by the direct road towards his sister's obscure lodging in the next county, he followed the highway to Casterbridge, some 15 miles off, where he remained drinking hard all that afternoon and evening, and where he lay that, and 2 or 3 succeeding nights, wandering thence along the Anglebury road to some village that way, and lying the Friday night after at his native place of Havenpool. The sight of the familiar objects there seems to have stirred him anew to action, and the next morning he was observed pursuing the way to Oozewood that he had followed on the Saturday previous, reckoning, no doubt, that Saturday night would, as before, be a time for finding Sir John with his sister again. He delayed to reach the place till just before sunset. His sister was walking in the meadows at the foot of the garden with a nursemaid who carried the baby, and she looked up pensively when he approached. Anxiety as to her position had already told upon her once rosy cheeks and lucid eyes, but concern for herself and child was displaced for the moment by her regard of Roger's worn and haggard face. "Why, you are sick, Roger, you are tired. Where have you been these many days? Why not keep me company a bit? My husband is much away, and we have hardly spoke at all of dear father and of your voyage to the new land. Why did you go away so suddenly? There is a spare chamber at my lodging." "Come indoors," he said. "We'll talk now, talk a good deal. As for him," nodding to the child, "better heave him into the river. Better for him and you." She forced a laugh, as if she tried to see a good joke in the remark, and they went silently indoors. "A miserable hole," said Roger, looking round the room. "Nay, but 'tis very pretty. Not after what I've seen. Did he marry he at church in orderly fashion?" "He did sure at our church at Havenpool, but in a privy way. Aye, because of his friends, it was at night time. Eda, ye fond one, for all that he's not thy husband, the RT not his wife, and the child is a bastard. He hath a wife and children of his own rank, and bearing his name, and that's Sir John Horseleigh of Clifton Horseleigh, and not plain Jack, as you think him, and your lawful husband. The sacrament of marriage is no safeguard nowadays. The king's new-made headship of the church hath led men to practice these tricks lightly." She had turned white. "That's not true, Roger," she said. "You are in liquor, my brother, and you know not what you say. Your seafaring years have taught ye bad things." "Edith, I've seen them. Wife and family all. How canst—" They were sitting in the gathered darkness, and at that moment steps were heard without. "Go out this way," she said. "It is my husband. He must not see thee in this mood. Get away till tomorrow, Roger, as you care for me." She pushed her brother through a door leading to the back stairs, and almost as soon as it was closed, her visitor entered. Roger, however, did not retreat down the stairs. He stood and looked through the bobbin hole. If the visitor turned out to be Sir John, he had determined to confront him. It was the night. She had struck a light on his entry, and he kissed the child and took Edith tenderly by the shoulders, looking into her face. "Something's gone awry with my dear," he said. "What is it? What's the matter?" "Oh, Jack," she cried, "I have heard such a fearsome rumour. What doth it mean? He who told me is my best friend. He must be deceived." "But who deceived him, and why? Jack, I was just told that you had a wife living when you married me, and have her still." "A wife? Yes, and children. Say no, say no. By God, I have no lawful wife but you, and as for children, many or few, they are all bastards, save this one alone. And that you be Sir John Horseleigh of Clifton? I mid be. I have never said so to E. But Sir John is known to have a lady, and issue of her." The knight looked down. "How did thy mind get filled with such as this?" he asked. "One of my kindred came." "A traitor! Why should he mar our life? Ah, you said you had a brother at sea. Where is he now?" "Here," came from close behind him, and flinging open the door, Roger faced the intruder. "Liar," he said, "to call thyself her husband." Sir John fired up and made a rush at the sailor, who seized him by the collar, and in the wrestle they both fell, Roger under. But in a few seconds he contrived to extricate his right arm, and drawing from his belt a knife which he wore attached to a cord round his neck, he opened it with his teeth and struck it into the breast of Sir John stretched above him. Edith had during these moments run into the next room to place the child in safety, and when she came back, the knight was relaxing his hold on Roger's throat. He rolled over upon his back and groaned. The only witness of the scene save the three concerned was the nursemaid, who had brought in the child on its father's arrival. She stated afterwards that nobody suspected Sir John had received his death wound, yet it was so, though he did not die for a long while, meaning thereby an hour or two, that Mistress Edith continually endeavoured to staunch the blood, calling her brother Roger a wretch, and ordering him to get himself gone, on which order he acted, after a gloomy pause, by opening the window and letting himself down by the sill to the ground. It was then that Sir John, in difficult accents, made his dying declaration to the nurse and Edith, and later the apothecary, which was to this purport, that the Dame Horseleigh, who passed as his wife at Clifton, and who had borne him 3 children, was in truth and deed, though unconsciously, the wife of another man. Sir John had married her several years before, in the face of the whole county, as the widow of one Decimus Strong, who had disappeared shortly after her union with him, having adventured to the north to join the revolt of the nobles, and on that revolt being quelled, retreated across the sea. 2 years ago, having discovered this man to be still living in France, and not wishing to disturb the mind and happiness of her who believed herself his wife, yet wishing for legitimate issue, Sir John had informed the king of the facts, who had encouraged him to wed honestly though secretly the young merchant's widow at Havenpool, she being therefore his lawful wife, and she only. That to avoid all scandal and hubbub, he had purposed to let things remain as they were till fair opportunity should arise of making the true case known with least pain to all parties concerned, but that, having been thus suspected and attacked by his own brother-in-law, his zest for such schemes and for all things had died out in him, and he only wished to commend his soul to God. That night, while the owls were hooting from the forest that encircled the sleeping townlet, and the South Avon was gurgling through the wooden piles of the bridge, Sir John died there in the arms of his wife. She concealed nothing of the cause of her husband's death, save the subject of the quarrel, which she felt it would be premature to announce just then, and until proof of her status should be forthcoming. But before a month had passed, it happened to her inexpressible sorrow that the child of this clandestine union fell sick and died. From that hour, all interest in the name and fame of the Horseleghs forsook the younger of the twain, who called themselves wives of Sir John, and being careless about her own fame, she took no steps to assert her claims, her legal position having indeed grown hateful to her in her horror at the tragedy. And Sir William Burt, the curate who had married her to her husband, being an old man and feeble, was not disinclined to leave the embers unstirred of such a fiery matter as this, and to assist her in letting established things stand. Therefore, Edith retired with the nurse, her only companion and friend, to her native town, where she lived in absolute obscurity till her death in middle age. Her brother was never seen again in England. A strangely corroborative sequel to the story remains to be told. Shortly after the death of Sir John Horseleigh, a soldier of fortune returned from the continent, called on Dame Horseleigh the fictitious, living in widowed state at Clifton Horseleigh, and after a singularly brief courtship, married her. The tradition at Havenpool and elsewhere has ever been that this man was already her husband, Decimus Strong, who remarried her for appearance sake only. The illegitimate son of this lady by Sir John succeeded to the estates and honours, and his son after him, there being nobody on the alert to investigate their pretensions. Little difference would it have made to the present generation, however, had there been such a one, for the family in all its branches, lawful and unlawful, has been extinct these many score years, the last representative but one being killed at the siege of Sherton Castle, while attacking in the service of the Parliament, and the other being outlawed later in the same century for a debt of £10 and dying in the county jail. The mansion house and its appurtenances were, as I have previously stated, destroyed, excepting one small wing, which now forms part of a farmhouse and is visible as you pass along the railway from Casterbridge to Evil. The outline of the old bowling green is also distinctly to be seen. This, then, is the reason why the only lawful marriage of Sir John, as recorded in the obscure register at Havenpool, does not appear in the pedigree of the House of Horseley.